was born in Tokyo, and that always seemed novel. I always had to explain that to people. I was born in '46, just after the war with Japan had ended. And my parents were married in '45 in Japan. They were trapped there during the war, and over the years as we were growing up, we learned more and more about that story, but we never knew any other parents or other Nisei that were in the same situation. It always seemed like it was unique. Certainly in the late 40s or early 50s, they were probably worried about vocalizing their experiences because, at that time, Tokyo Rose was on trial. They never talked about it much, but that was true of Nisei during that time anyhow, whether they went to the camps or anything else.
Those days, the Iseis, the first generation Japanese, wanted their child or children to be educated and brought up in Japan. That was their desire. So, therefore, my parents felt the same way, and they chose me to be sent there. I went to Japan November 11th, 1936, and I was 11 years old. I thought the place was very modern, especially Tokyo. Banners all over for 1940 Olympics. They never had the Olympics because of the war after that.
I was born in Torrance, California till 1938, and we moved up to Redwood City. I think my parents wanted to pack up and go back to Japan at the end of the year. The new year of school start from April. Like over here, they start from September. My father told my sister to take me back to Japan. I went to Japan 1941 April.
Let's see, I was born in 1924 in the town of Brawley in Imperial Valley. My mother's brother was married and did not have a child, so I was sent to Japan to be adopted by them. The term they use in Japanese is yoshi. I was 15 years old in 1939 when I went. It was sad and lonely when I left, but I just thought that was what I was supposed to do, so I did go. I remember my first impression was on the boat and it docked in Yokohama, and you saw all the people there on the dock, and that's one thing that really struck me. I said, wow, everybody has black hair, everybody's Japanese.
I was born in Seattle, Washington. My parents decided to go back to Japan, so they took all the kids to Japan.
I was born in 1934, Seattle, Washington. My parents brought me to Japan when I was 10 months old to see grandparents. My parents stayed in Japan for several years, so my second brother was born in Japan, but then parents alone themselves came back into the United States. Many times I try to ask them. I don't have any idea why that my parents decided to come to the United States by themselves.
During my days in high school, 34, 35, 36, there was a lot of discrimination. And we could have gone to college during those days. We could have. But you know what? After you graduated, you'd be polishing apples. My Japanese was terrible. I wasn't able to get any job in Japan unless I went to school there. And I studied. I hate to say that, but I really studied in Japan. I had to. I had spent a lot of money, my folks' money.
Well, I lived in Ceres, California, which is about 7 miles from Modesto. I wanted to continue my education. So I worked for a year in Tiburon, saved about $200 or something like that. Nowadays it seems like nothing, but in those days that was a lot of money because I was able to buy a ticket to go to Japan. I stayed with a very nice family who had lived in the United States, and they were not surprised at my different ways from them.
Middle brother of the 5 brothers was to be given away as an adopted son to my uncle who didn't have any children. So my mother was in effect delivering the merchandise. The 2 younger sons were too young to be looked after by my father. 2 of us accompanied the mother and the older brother. 2 oldest brothers and father stayed behind in Los Angeles. My mother stayed 3-4 months. Then she went back, and the rest of us stayed in Japan. I was 6, and the next brother was 9, and then the oldest of the 3 was 11.
My dad had his own business. He dealt in Japanese bonds and stocks. About 1940, he decided he didn't want to be in the business anymore. My mother went to kind of close out the business in Tokyo so he could retire. From LA, we stopped in San Francisco. Then from San Francisco, we stopped at Honolulu. And from Honolulu, went to Yokohama. So it took about 13, 14 days. We lived right near the university she went to. A lot of my mother's friends became teachers at the college, so they would come and visit us. You don't find too many women that graduates from college in those days. I went to the school, Waseda Kokusai Gakuin, which is Waseda International School.
The minute I said goodbye to my family at the San Francisco Pier, the homesickness hit me, really hit me.
I felt right at home. Maybe sometimes they thought we dressed a little differently, but we kind of blended in okay.
I just gradually fit into the group. But the kid knows I was from the United States because I still was wearing my American clothes with me when I went to school. Or there was some long pants, my sister just chopped it on, Japan, they used to wear shorts.
We went to barber shop and had crew cut just like Japanese, and shed our American clothes and bought Japanese clothes and tried to look like Japanese. The only thing I remember is we were bullied because we didn't speak good Japanese. Among 3 of us, we spoke English, of course. Neighborhood kids will call us spies.
I was so lonely, and I would just stay in my uncle's study day in, day out. I didn't have any friends. Nobody to talk to.
I knew that I had to learn Japanese because I could not communicate with anyone. Your language, you spoke accordingly, and so that you knew that the man was superior, or they thought that men were superior to women. And no matter what I thought, I would have to act as though I thought men were superior to women, which I really didn't care for at all.
Some of the words I used was not appropriate for a 15-year-old. I mean, I was probably using some like a baby talk. My hand is te, is just, you call it te, but baby talk is tete.
By the time I was in the first grade, nobody talked about my background.
We Americans received letters from the American consulate saying, go back to the United States as soon as you can. The letter did not say, well, the war is coming up, you better get going. No, that wasn't it. Just saying, go back to the United States. And my sister was visiting me at that time, and she packed up and left right away. But I wasn't going to go back because I wanted to finish my schooling.
My parents sent me a cablegram saying, take the next boat home. So I got rid of most of my things because, you know, I'd been there for 2 years and I didn't want those old clothes anyway, so and less to pack.
Japanese citizens, they have to get what you call a return permit from the U.S. government. She had to renew it, but since the renewal didn't come back, we couldn't come back in summer of 41. So instead of waiting for it, she applied for a Japanese passport. We left in December 2nd.
How did I hear that the war started? Yeah, through the radio. Early morning news. You know, they said the war was declared. Japanese planes bombed Pearl Harbor.
Here is the motion picture record released by the United States Navy of the havoc wrought by the Japs' sneak sky and sea raid on Pearl Harbor, America's mid-Pacific naval bastion. On December 7th, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards.
We were expecting it, more or less.
The militaristic, jingoism was going on already, and so it wasn't that much of a major shift in thinking.
The next morning, there was a Italian naval attaché on the boat, on the ship, I should say. And he said, you know, the sun's not in the right place. And he knew right away the ship had turned around, heading for Yokohama.
They told us to sleep with our shoes on. We don't know when we'll be torpedoed or what will happen to us.
I don't know how the other Nisei felt, because there were a lot of Niseis. And most of them were alone. You know, they went to Japan to school. And so, like myself, I had my mother, so, you know, it was easier.
A week after that we landed back in Yokohama, and I was so unhappy, and my whole world was falling apart, I felt. But just had to make do with what I had, and I went around begging some of my relatives for the clothes that I had given them.
Well, when the war started, the money that my parents were sending me stopped.
But I just kept on staying at the dorm, and nobody asked me for any money to pay for the tuition or anything. So I just kept on studying and doing the best I could.
First half of the war, everything was going good for, I guess, Japan. So we used to march down the street with the Japanese flag.
I look like the natives. I'm Japanese race. And I don't go around with a banner saying I'm a United States citizen.
One incident that the teacher told us to draw a picture, wall picture. And I decided to draw the Navy ship battle, and I put the American flag first. And teacher told me that he didn't wait for me to finish the drawing. When he saw that flag, I took the beating.
I was cautioned, since I am a United States citizen, don't write anything favoring the United States, because they call it Kempe, which is a secret police, that their eyes are shining, looking around. My teacher cautioned me.
Fault of the Japanese government, very much so, in most of their negotiations. They couldn't communicate properly and they were not understood correctly. So they said, how about getting Nisei, who can speak and communicate better in English, but at the same time teach them the Japanese, and Japanese culture and language.
Heiskan was established as a bridge between U.S. and Japan. They said the war is going to end sooner or later. Okay, and we were supposed to be the goodwill ambassadors between Japan and U.S.
It became known as a spy school. Whenever people can't quite understand something or don't know, all kinds of rumors happen. And that's what happened with Hitchcock.
We entered there, and they supplied with rooming, board, everything, plus spending money.
How I met Chick, I met him at school.
At the dormitory, I got pretty restless. I said, how about having a little get together and hold a dance party? But American music like that was forbidden. And those guys thought I was crazy, because why risk the anger or ire of the authorities? Well, I said, we got to show some defiance. So we said we'll close the doors and the windows. He said, what do we do about girls? I said, well, I know several. They were at the cook shop. But I was able to get a hold of about 4 girls, including his, and we got to know each other. And then I was invited to their house.
He used to come over, and then my mother would cook and nice dinner and so forth.
And she used to feed me good.
April of 1942, we were outside during the recess when I was going to girls' school. And all of a sudden, we saw a dark plane with no insignia swoop down on us. Prior to that, this plane dropped a bomb at the ship shipbuilding facility in Kobe. And later on, we heard that was a Doolittle plane.
This was the first brief answer to Japan that came from the skies. It was not to be the last. General Doolittle vowed,
"We're going back to Tokyo, and we shall go in full array and with mighty allies."
I heard the sound of an aircraft gun, and I remember running out to the yard and looking up, and there was one of the B-25s flying overhead.
That was the first air raid in Japan.
There were 2 exchange boats that were organized by the U.S. and Japanese governments. And the first one left Japan and U.S. in 1942.
They sent a boat from United States, boat from Japan, and they met at India, and they exchanged the people.
This man who was in my parents' relocation camp was on this boat.
Among the passengers coming back from United States were my family friend. So that's how I found out where my family was and what they were doing.
So he came to our house in Japan and told us what was going on. The fact that they were in a relocation camp, and at the big camp that had 10,000 people in. And also, an interesting thing I heard was that he said, "I think your mother is pregnant." So that's when I first learned that I was probably going to be an older brother. I never was until then. And indeed, a sister was born the following year. Mm-hmm.
In those days, you could send a letter through the Red Cross, but we never knew whether they actually received it or not.
I received a letter from them, and I sent the letter to them, and they got it through the Red Cross.
A year and a half later, one letter came that after the war started. That was from the Red City. I remember it went around the South Pacific, and about the time we received that letter, it was so blanked, it didn't make sense. It was so, censored. It didn't make sense, but I remember grandmother and I said, well, at least they wrote the letter, so they're okay. And that was it. And that was the first and last letter we received.
While I was in the dormitory, I had a roof over my head. But now when I graduated, there were no jobs open to me. My Nisei friend had said, "Oh, someone has an offer of marriage." And I said, "What?" And she says, "Yeah, they're very rich, nice people, and they would like to have you marry their son." That's better than begging on the streets or something like that. So I went through with that marriage and lived with the family, but I never felt at home there. I just felt like I'm being used to this or that just to survive, because there was no other way.
After the second, third year of the war, after Pearl Harbor, yes, things were getting short. And when I think about it now, it must have been very difficult for the family that I was living with.
My grandmother and I started to grow barley and sweet potato, whatever we can.
People would go out to the country and then negotiate with the farmers directly because we couldn't get any food.
Our children all get together and get some kind of weed or something for feed ourselves.
Well, we just went to fishing and catch any type of fish, and we even caught a grasshopper and we ate those. And sometime we caught a snake and we ate those. By the way, I don't think I could eat it now, but it was good.
When you're hungry, boy, you will eat anything. I ate grasshopper and banana squash so much. My palm of my hand turned yellow, back of my toe turned yellow. That's how much, but you had to eat, right? You had to survive.
I remember the first air raid we had, you know. I was really frightened.
We were ordered to dig a bomb shelter in our yard, each one of us. So the siren will go off. Then we had to turn the lights off at night. If it's a nighttime, turn the lights off and jump into the shelter. This went on and on and on.
What we did was we just slept with our clothes on in case we had to, you know, evacuate or something.
They didn't have any very good shelters. They just had a hole in the ground. So everything around you was burning, and you didn't want to stay inside the hole because you'd be just burned to death. So you'd have to get out and run to wherever you thought was safe. I had to just run for my life.
Cherry blossom was in full bloom. It was beautiful. And all of a sudden, I see these two planes fighting. I didn't know which one was American, which one was Japanese, but anyway, I knew they were fighting at each other. And that scenery I will never forget because it was a very beautiful cherry blossom in full bloom, and then the two planes they call it dog fighting.
If you weren't working, the army or some could take you, even the women. My mother had a friend that was part of a Mitsubishi family, and so she talked to her and they got me a job at Mitsubishi Trading Company in Tokyo, typing letters and orders.
When I was going to girls' school, we had to go to work at military factory, straightening out the nails so they could use it again. That's what we did in that hot, cottage-like place from morning till night, the whole summer long.
The sweet potato we grow, you know, you had to give it to the army, Before you give it to the army, you had to cut it, slice it, and you had to dry it. And you give it to the army. They weigh it, and they pay you by the pound. Well, pound. They don't call it pound, but it's dry, so it's pretty light. But what they made out of that was alcohol to fly the airplane.
We had to work for the government in some way. Otherwise, we were drafted by the government and sent to military facilities to work. I found this job taking care of the evacuation children from Osaka, Japan. They would evacuate them, and they were safe from the air raid.
Pine tree root. They used to chop that out in little pieces, and they steam it, and just like a distill thing, Yeah, they used to make an oil out of that too, and we helped dig in those roots too.
During the night, we would listen to the pilots when they were speaking to other pilots, because they were getting closer to Japan, and we'd write down what they said. So that wasn't hard. We'd work, I don't know how many hours, maybe 4 or 5 hours, and that's all we did.
The last year of the war, our entire class in the middle school was drafted into a naval munitions factory. And so instead of going to school, we all went to factory and worked there. There were almost daily bombings in those days, and being a factory, they dropped TNTs, real explosive bombs, rather than the incendiary bombs, the fire bombs, which were used to burn up houses. That was very scary. There was no bomb shelters for us peons. Only the factory managers and the naval officers had shelters to hide in. And there was a big river along the factory, and on the riverbed, there's quite a large area. So we spread out there, and the officer said, spread out as much as you can. So you don't touch your classmate next to you. And he said, well, the reason is if you huddle together, you may all be safe, but you may all die together. And if you spread out, some of you is more likely to die, but not all of you are going to die together. And that's more important for the country.
I used to walk to work because all the forms of transportation were shut down because of the bombing raids. During the war, we had to go through hell. And then we still tried to put out the paper. I was still the idealist that the press must go on. We got to give them accurate news to the people, and that sort of devotion.
The day we got married, in the morning, I think we had an air raid, but then by afternoon, everything was quiet, so we just had a quiet wedding upstairs in our house with a few neighbor friends.
There, the wedding, the sirens start going off. This was unusual during the day. Then we found out later that it was a 500-pound explosion, a bomb that they dropped right across the street from the Imperial Hotel. It sounded so close. You know, incendiaries, you get used to it. A bomb like that is entirely different again. It really scares the hell out of you.
Well, you know, they had what they call the firebomb, and it just happened to fall on the house and lost the home there. And then I went out to my relatives in the country, in Hiroshima.
We lived very close to Nakajima Hikojo, that is an Air Force base in Japan. And then I saw many, many times the bombings dropping. And then it was so scary.
My sister was living in the country. I was staying at her place. B-29s would fly in formation to go into Tokyo, coming over the Izu Peninsula and over Mount Fuji into Tokyo.
We went to the mountain. We used to call it Toge. It's the highest point from inside our village. Sure enough, we saw the aircraft carrier sitting there. Mm-hmm. Those fighters, they came down very low because I saw the pilot. That's how low they came down to our village.
In Japan, they had what they call register. And you had to be on that register in order to be drafted because they took all the names off that list there. And I was not on that list.
In 1944, I was just waiting to get the draft notice. I couldn't understand why I was not drafted sooner. We had a wooden box about a foot square with a handle on both sides and a strap over that we put over our neck. And we practiced or trained to stand at different formation and then to take this and dive. And what we were supposed to do is, this was to be filled with, this box was to be filled with explosive, and we were to dive under tanks with this. And you know, one of the first things that the leader, the officer who trained us said was that, you know, the Soviets have a lot of tanks, but they don't have as many tanks as the number of soldiers we have. So if every one of us could take out one tank, you know, we would outlast them. I mean, that's the way we were told. And none of us really questioned that. I very much took in what the Japanese government or the military or whatever you want to call it was telling the people how you should be or how you should act.
People started talking to each other that the war is going to end pretty soon. And we're not going to win this war. They keep whispering at each other.
Well, toward the end, 1945, when everything got bad, and in our village, I remember one of the regiment from Manchuria came back. And that time I was at 5th grade. The soldiers said, oh, we better get ready for the battle for the mainland. Then they went into our bamboo field, mountain, and we call it hachiku. Hachiku is about small bamboo like this, the 2-inch in diameter. They start to cut every single one of them. And my grandmother cried and cried, I said, why you had to cut all the bamboo? Next thing we know, they was sharpening it to the point. And they started to hand it out to all the civilians.
Oh, I saw the airplane. I saw there. Enola Gay. This plane here, I still remember. It came over there, it made a left turn, then I saw a big flash. I didn't know what it was.
I remember that big flash, and also that brass must be in brass, but because of the school window pane all shattered. I remember that definitely, but I don't remember any type of noise at all. Then later on, mushroom cloud came, and the kind of black soot type of rain came down on us. Then a couple of days later, we could see that people coming out of the city, and we sort of village sort of opened at the Buddhist temple, and took care of them, and until that they be able to go someplace wherever they want to go. So I don't have any actual war experience, but I saw enough sufferings. Like for instance, that when the people die from atomic bomb, they just pick the peoples and just lay up on that anywhere they could find open space, and they just burn them. And I could still, remember the smell of the burning body. So, some just died real quick.
They didn't know it was atomic bomb. Oh, there was all kinds of rumors.
When we evacuated out of city, myself and my second brother went to country with grandmother. Grandfather stayed in the city for a while, but he also moved to country just before the atomic bomb, so we all survived.
Mother's uncle, he was working in Hiroshima City. He worked at the railroad station. And fortunately, it was just 8 o'clock, and it was change of schedule. And he was in the basement, and he was saved. But he said, don't go. He said, there's no Hiroshima.
The devastation you see here was caused by the explosion of the bomb above this 0 point. Only the strongest buildings are left standing, and they are gutted. Looking north from 0 point, this is what was left.
For those children went out of city with school teachers, they became an instant orphan because parents stayed in the city and they died from atomic blast, but the children survived. See, but then so there are a few children like that in our school too.
I knew there was going to be a big broadcast and the emperor was going to speak to the country, and that's when I knew the war was going to end.
The recording, which was used for broadcasting, was very garbled, and not just me, but everybody who heard it says that it was very difficult to make out. For one thing, he spoke in this quaint, ancient language, and which was hard to make out. But beyond that, the sound was very bad.
I was surprised how young and old, they were so upset that they said we should just go on and then try to win the war. And it was very obvious that what was coming up eventually.
When we finished listening, we all said, "Looks like we lost the war." You know, it wasn't clear at all. But by that was noon. The broadcasting was done at noon, and by mid-afternoon, word spread that Japan surrendered, and everybody knew. And by the evening, there was already a rumor that the Americans had landed, and it was said that the Americans are looting all the food storages. So we have to distribute all the food we have. We stayed up all night distributing food. And then it turned out there was a rumor.
In August, Japan surrendered. I had just finished my basic training when Japan surrendered. One of the soldiers said he heard a civilian man saying that there was the emperor's broadcast the day before about Japan surrendering. And then we're told to return our weapons. That's the word you use, the Japanese used, to return our weapons. And we walked there, and sure enough, there's a pile of rifles there, and we take our rifle and throw it on top of the pile and all that. We walk into this big former Japanese military compound, and then the gates closed on us. And that's when most of us feel like, oh, we're prisoners or something. Because right at the gate, there were Russian soldiers with their machine gun and everything. Formally, I didn't even hear that the Russian had entered the war against Japan. I think there's close to 2,000 of us. We march out of the camp, and this time there's soldiers on both sides. You know, not that many, but they're guarding us, and we climb onto boxcars, and we don't know where we're going, but everybody hopes and thinks we're going to go south, but the train instead goes north. We must have traveled on the train for about 10 days, and we finally reach Krasnoyarsk and get off there. And by that time, we pretty much all think we're prisoners and we're going to have to do some labor.
What country the soldier wear short skirt? Scotland? They came, that inspection team gonna go through the main highway. So you know not to get out of the house, go close to the highway. So that was the beginning of occupation of Kochi City. They start looking, and all the people who have the sword or spear, old time spear, they were taken away that time, huh? Somehow they had a name, all the people who carried those things.
Osaka, where I was, had the biggest port, but it was fully mined. They couldn't have come close to it. So they landed in Wakayama, and then all the material was brought to Osaka by land route on a highway. And our high school or middle school was located right on this highway at the terminus, Osaka terminus. Jeeps and trucks and the personnel cars and the Red Cross cars and tanks and everything else being brought in by vehicles. Nobody was walking. And in fact, we were told that there weren't enough human beings, GIs, to bring in all the vehicles. So they took train back to Wakayama to bring in more vehicles. And it was really an amazing sight as we watched from the second floor of our school building. And we said, no wonder we lost the war.
It's funny. We're waiting and waiting for the streetcar to come, and this Jeep comes around, and before I know, they're here again. I guess I must have looked different, like maybe I was from America or something. And then he would go like this, and so I went. Then he was surprised that I spoke English. And then he says, well, we could take you home. Here we were lined up waiting for the streetcar. So I was with my mother and a neighbor friend who was Japanese. And this lady said, come on, they offered to take us home. We'll be okay, But my mother kind of hesitated, but this lady insisted, so we got into the Jeep and they brought us home, And from then, they just come and visit us. They're lonesome too, and if they find somebody that could speak English and, friendly, they will come and visit.
When I was working for the Red Cross, I was supervising the Japanese women who made donuts. But that was good because I never ate so many donuts in my life. That was all I existed on.
And by that time, SCAP, Supreme Command they wanted a organ like ours to convey all the good things that the American occupation was doing.
Gradually, I found other jobs in the Army that we could work at until we were finally able to come home.
I worked for Atami Hotel, which was one of the designated hotels for the GIs. And I don't know what I was. I guess I was just an interpreter. I met a couple of friends, my school friends, and when I went to school in the state of Washington, in Seattle, Washington, they were GIs, and I just happened to run into them.
Those days, the letters from GIs always were in an airmail envelope, and it had the San Francisco PO number. And so we looked at it and thought, well, we got a letter from San Francisco. And when we opened it, I found out that it was for a brother who was stationed in Japan. And he said, I'm going to come to see you on a certain date at a certain time. So he asked three of us to come. It was a Sunday, so we could all go. And he told us to wait at the northern end of a such and such bridge in Osaka. And so we waited, and sure enough, we saw this GI in uniform. And so that was my brother, and so that's how we found out about the family.
Care package started to come from home, from my parents. That was a big relief. Then your black market start, sell the coffee, soap, and sugar supplement, what do you call it, saccharin? Oh, that was, I made money on that because there was, Japan, they called ice candy, the popsicle shop. They really liked that saccharin, so I really made money on that saccharin. I hit all the popsicle shop in the summertime. To get into the train, you jump in from window and jump out for the window. Otherwise you won't be able to get on the train. That's how I did my black market.
And it was very hard work. Unloading a coal car was very hard because I guess the train would come in and it was scheduled when to come in and when to leave. So it had to be unloaded very fast. This rough work like that, for me, it only lasted the first winter. By December, with malnutrition, I become sick and I go into the hospital and I stay there for 5 months. And when I come out, very fortunately, there's somebody who works at the headquarters who's in charge of personnel, and he finds a good job for me. Foundry where I worked, they made all kinds of things, but the particular thing I was making was the caliper tracks for tanks. And I also worked where they were finishing the anti-aircraft gun, painting. In August, the first frosts come, I go back to the camp and I'm sent to another camp, and that's when I wind up in the coal mine.
My brother sent me the money, and I think it was about a year between the ending of the war and when I was able to come home. My parents and Blanche, my youngest sister, were living together in Cambridge, and that's where I went when I came back from Japan. So I was so happy to be home, could speak English all I wanted, and not have to bow to people.
My mother came to pick me up in San Francisco with my brother, the brother who was in Japan as a GI. They came along with my sister. So I met my sister for the first time there, and my mother for the first time in 11 years. And we all drove back to Los Angeles.
My brother-in-law, Mas Ishikawa, was volunteered from Tule Lake relocation camp. He was one of the first troops coming into Japan. He looked me up because my mother's desire was, well, when you see Taz, please give her this money. Mas gave me the money, and I thought, whoo, I'm so glad. That's when I thought, whoa, I'm free, I'm free. I took the SS General Gordon, which was a military transport. And they would take the soldiers to Japan, and then on the way, then the boat will come back with the civilian. That's the boat I took. My father came after me at San Francisco. So when I saw him at the pier waiting for me, yes, it was very emotional. It wasn't. It was good to see them, but on the other hand, I just couldn't feel very close to them after 11 years of being away from them. Yeah. Even my mother, too. I thought of my mother for 11 years, and that's all I thought about. But when I saw her, she was so different from what I thought she would be. But it was nice to see her. Yes, wonderful. Yeah.
But we all knew that if we stayed alive, that we will be able to go home. At least that's the way we felt. We didn't know when, but we never thought that we would be locked up here forever. It was always next spring. We looked forward to it like that. I don't think there were any Japanese who even tried to escape, because when we were taken, we observed from the train that when you came to a bridge where the train crossed, on both sides of the bridge there would be guards, a soldier standing there. We saw things like that, and they said, where can we go? You know, we don't have a map, we don't know where we are. They published a newspaper, they called it Nihon Shimbun, which meant Japanese newspaper. And most of the things were anti-U.S., you know, or about things against the Marshall Plan, and then about the occupation of Japan, and opposition to the emperor's system in Japan. Those things were just constantly, and then the opposite of the communist system being better. Then they had entertainment night where they put on skits, and usually those skits were about glorifying the Soviet system and tearing down the U.S. and show scenes of what's happening in Japan under the occupation. They would show a drunken U.S. soldier going into the bar, drinking, not paying, grabbing the woman and raping her or something like that.
Went in 40 and then came back in 47. My dad, you know, was retired, but then his good friend came to Chicago. And my dad was all alone at the time, so he told him to come to Chicago. So that's what he did, because he can't stay in camp. And a lot of the Japanese relocated in Chicago. I think people were very nice, and they could have jobs right away, you know. So that's how we happened to be here.
My father sent me a letter to come back to the United States. I wanted to stay in Japan because I just couldn't let my grandmother live by herself. But he insisted that for me to come back. The day I left Japan to come back, my grandmother said, I want one message here. I want you to give it to your father. I'll tell you in Japanese, okay, and you can see that. こう思う 親の心は皆一つ. That's all I want you to tell your father. 1949, April 8th, I got on the ship, President Cleveland, and I guess my parents couldn't afford a good place. My assigned room was right by the back, right by the big screw. I remember. I wanted a big hug for my mother, and I didn't get that, as to this day I'm kind of mad for my mother. I wanted that big hug from her, you know. But I don't know what her reason was. Mm-hmm. So, you know, my English was no good over here when I came back. And so my dad said, first thing is to learn how to have a conversation with the people. Best way to go is a grammar school. So they put me into the 5th grade. Here I'm 16 years old, going to grammar school. But he was right.
In springtime, they made a list of repatriates, and I got on that list because I was not working, so I wasn't producing. It wasn't to their benefit, I guess, or malnutrition patient. Nautka is a port, small port that the U.S. Navy used during the war as a submarine base, we were told, to sink the ship in the Japan Sea. Anyway, that's where we were sent to by train, and then we spent about 4 days there. Everybody on pins and needles. You don't feel safe until you get on the ship. And finally, they said, the ship's in. We're going to get on. And we make it. In June, I'm repatriated back to Japan. That September, I go to work for the occupation. And I become an interpreter. They put a fancy title like advisor. I don't know what it is, but I do that translation work until 1951. That's just when the occupation is going to end. My mother in the United States says something like, you should continue your education more, so why don't you come back to the United States? Yeah, altogether, I was gone for 13 years. 1939 to 1952.
I had a good job in Japan. I had no desire to come back here because I would have to start all over again. My wife and children, they came back in 53, and I came back here in 1954.
I just grew up with my grandparents and didn't even think, about parents whatsoever. Until we start getting a care package from Japan, US. Yeah, then I knew that I have a family in this country here. Not until that time, the parents just didn't enter into my life at all. After I came back to the United States when I was 16, I had to really struggle to learn English, and I'm still learning.
Came back U.S. is 1967. I came back with my mother. Yes. Well, I think I'm glad to came USA, United States.
About 10 years ago, I decided to interview my father about what happened. Well, actually, it was more general about his life, but a lot of it centered on what happened in Japan. It's all transcribed, and I transferred it to the Mac, to the tape file. I just felt like we should just try to get it all down so, our kids and, other parts of the family could know about it.
But your father spoke, I guess, a country Japanese. It was
He couldn't understand them, and they couldn't understand him.
So Japanese in the country is that much different.
Oh, yeah.
I think that the material abundance is what really amazed me. U.S., you already had the supermarkets. You walk in there and you see piles and piles of food, when in Japan in 1947, food was still rationed, and people were starving to death, literally. And so that was the biggest surprise.
What would you like to have to eat? Because you haven't had American food for so long. And you know what? I said, I'd like to have liver and onions. Oh. After all those years, I thought, oh, that's something I haven't eaten for a long time.
Because you do make friends, too, while you're there. And you kind of suffer together. So I had a couple of friends at Mitsubishi, where I worked. And for a long time, we were corresponding a lot. And they were Japanese, strictly Japanese girls,
I am still not fluent. I lived there for many years, but I don't speak as the Japanese would. I speak like a Nisei, or second generation Japanese. They know right away when I start speaking that I'm not a Japanese born.
I don't want to have any war. It's so scary. So I hope everything is peaceful.
So when did the two of you meet?
Well, we used to go to same school called it learning English as a second language.
After I came back, got married, and when I saw my children, when they were 11 years old, I thought, gee, this is the year I was sent to Japan. It's so young. And I start feeling sorry for myself.
2002, October, I was there for 3 weeks, and I did the whole I did the thing I wanted to do. I went to each tombstone, and I reported whatever happened and apologized to them for my mother's not coming back. And after I came back to the United States after that trip, it was a big relief for me. I wanted to do that so much.
Probably because of my experience of being prisoner, I feel, you can't, I'm oversimplifying, I'm sure, but, a war is a terrible thing, and no one gains, I don't think, and hopefully there's other ways that differences can be resolved.